She sat on a bench by the Charles River, clutching the strap of her purse, eyes fixed on the Longfellow Bridge, where people passed by like a silent film. Her heart pounded, not because of the cold April wind, but because of the man walking toward her. Her first love. Now a stranger, yet somehow more familiar than anyone else. They hugged, awkward, but warm. Neither said a word at first, as if both were trying to hold on to the fading scent of a long-lost youth. Then they stepped into a small cafe on Beacon Street, where the soft yellow lights and the sound of old jazz stirred something in her she had buried for over 20 years. It was supposed to be just coffee, just a conversation, a few memories. But as the evening wore on, as the old stories slipped into quiet pauses, their eyes lingered longer, their hands found each other under the table, and poor decisions began to take shape in that fleeting moment. That night, they booked a hotel room on Tremont Street. No one protested. When the door closed behind them, everything burst open, like an old record suddenly playing again. Passionate, hesitant, foolish. Familiarity blurred the years, made them forget how far life had drifted from those college days. But that hotel bed wasn't just a place to relive the past. It was the beginning of an ending. And they both knew by morning the world would no longer be whole. Julia was 47. She lived in a quiet suburb in Connecticut, in a 2-story house with a wide porch and a backyard that bloomed with lavender every summer. She had the life many women dream of. A gentle husband named Mark, a civil engineer, 2 kids in college, and a part-time job at the local library. Each morning, Julia made coffee for her husband, walked their dog Max around the neighborhood, then came home to water the plants, listen to classical music, and read. A quiet, cozy rhythm. Comfortable, repetitive. To everyone else, Julia was the picture of a fulfilled woman. She didn't complain, didn't grumble, gave no sign of discontent. But inside, there were moments, quiet moments, when something unnamed stirred. Evenings when, after tidying the kitchen and greeting Mark at the door, Julia would stand by the window and feel like she was living as a ghost in her own home. Maybe that's why, when she saw Nathan's name pop up in her People You May Know list on Facebook, something inside her sparked. She hadn't planned to message him, just wanted to see his photos, just check how he looked after all these years. But then, she sent a friend request, and just days later, everything began to change in ways she never expected. Julia and Mark had been married for 22 years. They met when she was 25 and he was a young engineer, building his career. It started with long conversations that lasted past midnight, tight hugs at train stations, beach trips with sandwiches and sodas in a cooler. Julia didn't remember the exact moment she fell in love with Mark, but she remembered that being with him felt peaceful. They married after 2 years of dating, bought a house, had 2 kids. Mark was steady, no partying, never forgot a birthday, always came home for dinner. He never yelled, never missed the important things. But slowly, so slowly even he didn't notice, he grew distant. Mark was a good man, a very good man. But sometimes, being good isn't enough to keep a marriage alive. Over time, a quiet routine formed between them. Not out of conflict, but because they both believed that being stable was enough. Their dinners were pleasant, almost too quiet. She asked about his work, he asked about the new books at the library. Every night they watched TV, on separate chairs under separate blankets in separate worlds. Their touches grew rare. Their morning kisses faded into habit. Quick, bland, like checking off a box. Julia didn't feel unhappy, but she began to miss the thrill of her youth, the way her heart used to race just from the sound of a phone ringing. And that's when she realized. It had been a long time since anyone made her heart feel anything at all. That was the space Nathan stepped into. His first message was simple. A wave, a smiley face, a "you still look beautiful." And just like that, the years Julia thought she'd tucked away gently stirred back to life. There wasn't one specific moment when Julia realized she felt empty. It didn't strike like lightning. It eroded slowly, day by day, week by week, year by year, until she began to feel like she was fading inside her own life. She was still doing everything right. Dinner on the table at 6. House clean. family appointments scheduled down to the hour. But none of it seemed to matter. Not really. She didn't blame Mark. He hadn't done anything wrong. And maybe that's what made it harder to explain. This loneliness wrapped in the kindness of a man who no longer looked at her the way he used to. Once, she cut her hair shorter just the way Mark used to like it. That night, when he walked into the kitchen, Julia waited for a compliment. He glanced up and asked, "What's for dinner?" She smiled, answered him, and stayed silent for the rest of the meal. At night, they lay beside each other, but their bodies were separated by a quiet, invisible gap. No curiosity, no touch, no whispered words. They didn't argue, they'd moved past that long ago. What remained now was a polite silence, like two longtime roommates who simply got used to the quiet. Julia started spending more time online, not looking for anything, just trying to escape the dullness of her everyday life. She scrolled through pictures of old friends until she stumbled across a familiar name, Nathan Green, her first love, the boy who once wrote her poetry, the one who drove her down Cape Cod with the Smiths playing from his beat-up car. Just one click, then a friend request, then a casual message. Julia never planned for any of this. She just thought, maybe a little nostalgia would remind her that she was still alive, still seen, still someone, not just a name on her husband's to-do list. But it was in those small moments that life began to shift. Nathan Green, his name once meant the world to Julia. They had fallen in love back in college in Boston. Nathan had been the first to teach her longing, handwritten letters, standing in the rain just to say, "I'm sorry." But life pulled them in different directions. Julia left the city for a job. Nathan chased music and endless travels. They broke up with tears, not because they stopped loving each other, but because they couldn't walk the same road. And yet, after all these years, he was still there. Same crooked smile in his profile picture. Same soulful eyes she once adored. The first message from Nathan came on a quiet afternoon. She was sitting in the library, flipping through a book she couldn't focus on, when the message arrived. Just a simple sentence. "Is that really you? I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me." She laughed, then replied, "It's me. And you still say the kind of things that make people's hearts skip a beat." And just like that, they started talking again. At first, it was small talk, life, work, family. Then slowly, the questions went deeper. "Do you still remember that cafe from back then? I still have your last letter." And then came the late-night messages, when Mark was asleep and Julia was still holding her phone, caught between excitement and guilt. Nathan was living in Boston now, still single, still writing music, still living in that untamed, unteachable way of his. One day he wrote, "I have a small gig in Cambridge this weekend. If you happen to be in town, come by. I'm going to play the song I wrote for you." Julia hadn't planned on going. She really hadn't. But after countless nights lying awake, after looking into Mark's eyes and seeing no spark left, she decided to lie, to say she was visiting an old friend in the city. When the train pulled into South Station, her heart was pounding like it had 25 years ago. Nathan was waiting, holding a small bouquet, eyes filled with a quiet emotion he didn't bother to hide. And in that first embrace, Julia knew. The feelings had never disappeared. They'd only been asleep. Until now. They sat together in a little cafe in Beacon Hill, warm yellow lights casting a glow over the silver now visible in Nathan's hair. Julia couldn't stop looking at him. Partly because she was moved, and partly because she was stunned to realize. He still made her feel things, just with his eyes, just by the way he listened. The conversation flowed easily, like they'd only been apart a few months, not nearly 3 decades. No awkwardness, no hesitation. They talked about music, travel, youth, and all the things they never said when they were in love. When Nathan admitted he had once gone to her wedding just to watch from afar, Julia felt breathless. "I just needed to know you were happy," he said gently. "Then I left before anyone saw me." That night, after his small show in a cozy bar, he invited her back to his apartment. Julia had planned to say no. She should have said no. But her heart, parched from years of a quiet, dutiful marriage, was suddenly alive with a different kind of tenderness. Not rushed passion, but connection. as if two lost souls had finally found their way back. Nathan's apartment wasn't large, but it was warm. Books, guitars, old art on the walls, and the scent of wood and peppermint tea. They sat close on the couch, listening to the song Nathan had written for her. When the music stopped, neither of them said a word. Nathan reached for her hand, his voice low. "Do you still see me as the same man from back then? Or just a stranger now?" Julia looked into his eyes and whispered, "I don't know, but I want to be here, right now." The first kiss came as gently as a sigh. Not hurried, not loud, just two people. Once in love, once lost, trying to find something buried long ago. As they lay next to each other, breath slowing beneath the dim ceiling light, Julia knew she'd crossed a line. She didn't cry. She didn't feel ashamed. What she felt was something else entirely, like she had just uncovered a forgotten part of herself. But somewhere deep inside, she also knew the price of that feeling might be steep. Nathan's apartment was on the third floor of an old building in Back Bay. Exposed brick walls, dark wood floors, and windows that opened to a view of rooftops bathed in the soft glow of street lamps. Everything about that space made Julia feel like she was dreaming, or like she had stepped into a different life, one unburdened by roles and responsibilities. They had already kissed down on the sidewalk, just the two of them under the quiet sky. But it wasn't until the door closed behind them that the kiss truly caught fire. At first, it was gentle, tentative touches, the hesitation of two people too used to keeping their feelings under wraps. But then years of longing and the echo of something familiar from youth took over. And suddenly, there was no holding back. Nathan held her like he was afraid she'd disappear. His hand traced the curve of her back, pulled her close. Julia's body responded instinctively. Her breath quickened, heart racing, every nerve ending coming alive. Coats, scarves, buttons. Everything fell to the floor in soft thuds, marking each layer of resistance she left behind. They collided and clung to each other with the hunger of people who knew there wasn't time to be careful anymore. Nathan lifted her, laid her on the small bed with its crisp white sheets. His hands moved with the memory of decades of longing, relearning every curve. Their breathless gasps, the low moans, became their own kind of music, offbeat, messy, but somehow perfect. They didn't need rhythm. They just needed feeling. In that moment, Julia wasn't thinking about Mark, or the kids, or anything else but the man in front of her. Nathan whispered her name like a prayer, and she held onto him like someone drowning clinging to a lifeline. When it was over, they stayed wrapped in each other's arms, saying nothing. Just the slow turn of a ceiling fan and the thudding of hearts still trying to calm. Julia knew she wasn't the same woman who had walked into that apartment, and her life from this point on wouldn't be the same either. At first, Julia told herself it would end with that night. Just one slip, one moment of weakness, a fleeting nostalgia she could tuck away and never speak of again. But reality didn't cooperate. The next morning, as she left Nathan's apartment and returned to her hotel, her legs felt too heavy to move. They stood under the awning, looking at each other in silence. Then Nathan leaned in and whispered, "I want to see you again, not because of last night, but because I never really stopped caring about you." That sentence haunted her all day, and when his next message appeared on her phone that afternoon, just a place and a time, Julia didn't hesitate. They met again 2 days later, in a park by the Charles River. No one mentioned sex. No one talked about feelings. But their eyes said everything. They sat close, shared sandwiches and coffee, then walked for miles like it was just a regular middle-aged date. But in every step was a quiet unrest. Part of Julia wanted to stretch that peace as long as she could. The other part wanted to end it before reality came crashing back in. But she couldn't stop. After every meeting, Julia felt both relieved and hollow. And then, Nathan would invite her back to his place and she would say yes. Their later encounters no longer carried the thrill of surprise. They had become so familiar that it started to scare her. She was afraid of how gentle his touch was. Afraid of the way Nathan looked at her, like she was still the same girl from years ago. Free of responsibility, untouched by the weight of life. Every time she stepped into that apartment, she forgot who she was. In there, she wasn't Mark's wife. She wasn't the mother of two. She was just Julia, the woman Nathan had never stopped loving. But repetition brought unease. Every time she unlocked her phone, every time she stepped out of the hotel, Julia felt like someone was watching her. And lying next to Nathan, she sometimes thought of her husband, of her children, and felt the distance between the two worlds she was trying so hard to keep apart grow wider and wider. The meetings continued until the very last day of her trip. When Julia boarded the plane home, Nathan's goodbye wasn't sad. It was quiet, accepting, as if both of them knew this couldn't go on forever. But Julia knew the hardest part wasn't leaving Nathan. It was facing herself after betraying everything she once believed in. That afternoon, Logan Airport was soaked in rain. Julia walked out of arrivals, pulling her small suitcase behind her. Mark was waiting at the pickup zone, waving, smiling. That same gentle, familiar smile he'd had for years. She smiled back, but even she could feel how forced it was. As the car pulled away from the airport, Mark talked about the kids, the broken dishwasher, the parent-teacher meeting she'd missed. Julia nodded, but her ears felt like they were underwater. In the rearview mirror, she saw herself, but didn't recognize the woman staring back. That evening, sitting at the dinner table with her family, Julia felt like an intruder in her own home. The chatter, the kitchen lights, the smell of grilled meat. It was all so familiar, yet felt like a shell. Inside, she was melting from the weight of guilt. She had lied, not just to her husband, but to herself. She had always believed she wasn't the kind of person who could cheat. She thought morals, duty, and love would be enough to anchor her. But all it took was one moment of weakness and everything unraveled. In the days that followed, Julia tried to return to routine. She went to work, cooked meals, drove the kids to school, cleaned the house. But none of it felt real. Every time Mark hugged her from behind, her body tensed. Every time her daughter asked if she'd had fun on the trip, her heart twisted. She told no one, not her best friend, not a therapist. But every night, she dreamed. And in those dreams, Mark's face blurred with Nathan's. One gaze was full of hurt, the other full of longing. She would wake up with tears on her pillow. Julia didn't know who to confess to. She felt unworthy of her family, yet too afraid to destroy it. She kept trying to tell herself it was just a moment, that everyone makes mistakes. But her conscience refused to forgive her. She started avoiding Mark's eyes, even the bathroom mirror. She grew quiet, cautious, moving through life like a shadow. No one knew what had happened in Boston, but Julia knew, and she felt it in every breath, in every quiet beat of her heart. A few hours of action, but consequences that would last for years. Julia never imagined the truth would come out so simply. It was an early autumn evening. She was in the shower. Mark lay curled up in bed, scrolling through her phone to find a family photo from last Christmas, the one he wanted to use for a holiday card. Julia always took the pictures and saved them in her phone. It wasn't strange. But then Mark accidentally tapped the Facebook Messenger icon. A short conversation popped up. Not long, not dramatic, just a few lines. "Are you home yet? I miss the smell of your hair." That moment. Let's never forget it. The most recent message was just 2 days old. Mark's heart froze. At first, he didn't understand. But then he saw the sender's name, Nathan, and everything shattered. This wasn't someone from the family. Not someone he knew. And the tone, there was no mistaking it. This was a man who had been in bed with his wife. The first feeling was a chill down his spine, then pain, then rage. A slow, spiraling rage, like someone throwing stones at his chest, over and over again. Julia stepped out of the bathroom, hair still damp, and saw Mark sitting motionless, her phone in his hand. His face was pale, lips pressed tight. She knew instantly. No need to ask. No need to pretend. Everything she had tried so hard to bury over the past month. It was over. "Mark!" She whispered his name, as if asking for mercy. He stood up, held the phone out toward her. His eyes locked on hers. Not with love, but with hurt and disbelief. "What is this?" His voice wasn't loud, but it trembled, like he couldn't believe what he'd just read. She said nothing. She couldn't lie, but she didn't have the strength to tell the truth either. Tears began to slide down Julia's face, and that was her confession. Wordless but undeniable. In that moment, there was no shouting, no broken furniture, no dramatic outburst. Just a quiet rupture, unmistakable. The sound of a heart breaking when there's no strength left to hold it together. That night, they said nothing more. No accusations. No questions. Julia slept on the couch, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring into the darkness. Her mind ran through every possible outcome. Maybe he'd forgive her. Maybe he'd want to talk. Maybe she'd get a chance to explain. But the next morning, when she walked into the kitchen, Mark's eyes told her everything. They were empty. No tenderness. No curiosity. Just the eyes of a man who'd been hurt so deeply. He had nothing left to hold on to. "How long?" he asked, still pouring coffee like any other day, his voice calm, too calm. "Just once? In Boston," she blurted, eyes red and swollen. "I didn't mean to. I don't know why." "You knew?" Mark cut her off, still not looking at her. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Don't say you didn't mean to." His voice wasn't loud, but cold as ice, and that restraint hurt more than any scream ever could. Julia nodded, too ashamed to defend herself. Inside her was a storm of chaos, regret, fear, and a desperate wish for some kind of miracle to turn back time. Mark stayed silent for a long while, then said, "I can't look at you the same way anymore. And it's destroying me." That sentence wasn't just blame, it felt like a final eulogy for what used to be called trust. They began avoiding each other in the house, eating separately, sleeping in different rooms. Conversations grew shorter, colder, emptier. Julia tried writing him a letter by hand, pouring out her feelings, speaking of loneliness and mistakes, but Mark never responded. When he brought up the idea of a separation, there were no more tears left. Julia just nodded. She knew she had pushed them both to this point. "I'm not doing this out of hate," Mark said, "but because if I keep living next to you, I won't be able to be myself anymore." To Julia, those words felt like a sentence being handed down. She wasn't just losing a husband. She was losing her best friend, the person she trusted most, and the version of herself that once existed before everything crumbled from a single moment of weakness. A week after that last conversation, Mark packed a few personal belongings and moved out. There were no dramatic scenes, no begging or pleading, just a quiet hug for their son, and one final look at Julia, as if saying goodbye to someone who had once meant everything, but wasn't there anymore. Julia stood in the doorway, her hands trembling, heart falling into a void. She once believed they would make it, through love, through the years they'd spent together, through family. But some cracks can't be sealed with time. Some wounds can't be healed with just an apology. "What are you going to do next?" Julia's sister asked during a phone call. "I don't know," she choked out. "I kept thinking I had time to fix it, but Mark didn't want to wait." After Mark moved out, Julia lived like a ghost inside a house full of memories. Every corner of the kitchen, every photo on the wall, every glance from her son. All silent reminders of what she had destroyed, all for a fleeting moment of emotion. She wrote a letter to Mark, not to beg him to come back, but to finally tell the full truth. About why she went looking for Nathan. About the boredom and emptiness she never dared to speak of in their marriage. About the mistaken belief that an old memory could somehow save a present-day soul. And at the end of the letter, she wrote, "I don't expect your forgiveness. I just want you to know, the betrayal didn't come from a lack of love, but from a lack of courage to face the distance between us. I was wrong, and I've paid for it." Mark didn't reply, but Julia knew he had read it. The decision was made. They filed for divorce at the end of fall. It all happened quietly, no fights over assets, no custody battles. Just two people choosing different paths, both carrying scars that hadn't yet healed. Julia didn't go back to Nathan. There was no happy ending to that affair. What remained was a middle-aged woman, alone with herself, and with the consequences of a weakness she would carry for the rest of her life. After the divorce hearing in early October, Julia officially became a single woman at 47. She returned home alone, and for the first time the three-bedroom house felt too big, too quiet. The familiar sounds. Mark typing in the evenings, the TV humming while he watched sports, her son's footsteps running through the house, were now nothing but silent memories. The house was still the same, but everything inside it felt different. Every morning, Julia looked into the bathroom mirror, wondering how things could have changed so fast. A few messages, a single trip, one night. That's all it took to tear down a family that took over 20 years to build. Their son, Andrew, 17 years old, chose to live with his father after the divorce. Julia didn't blame him, but she spent every night aching for the sound of his laughter, the random chatter over dinner, even the arguments about school and his future. Now, she only saw him on weekends, and even then, he seemed distant. Not angry, but no longer trusting. Julia went back to work at the university library where she was the manager. Her co-workers welcomed her with warmth, but the glances from a few, who had likely heard rumors, made her feel even more out of place. She avoided small talk, left early, and spent more time journaling. On those pages, Julia confessed to herself that she still loved Mark, still missed Andrew, and that not a day passed without wishing she'd chosen differently. As for Mark, he moved in with his sister near downtown Boston. Julia heard he had started attending a support group for those who'd been betrayed, and sometimes posted quiet reflections on social media. He never mentioned names, but Julia could tell. Some part of him was still struggling to heal. She didn't try to reach out again. No apologies, no flowers on his birthday. Just silence. The kind shared between two people who once loved deeply but could never go back. After the divorce, Julia began to realize that the true cost of her mistake wasn't the loss of love. It was the subtle change in how people saw her. Longtime friends who used to come over for dinner now seemed hesitant. Some of the mutual friends she shared with Mark quietly chose sides. They still liked her photos, still left birthday wishes, but the invitations, the texts, slowly stopped. Worst of all was her relationship with Andrew. He didn't lash out, didn't scream or cry, but his silence was the deepest cut. Weekend visits grew awkward and quiet. His answers were brief. He no longer shared school stories or asked about her day. He kept a polite but cold distance. Julia could feel it, how the admiration that used to light up his eyes was gone. She was no longer the smartest, strongest woman in the world, as he'd once called her when he was little. Even her relationship with her own family couldn't escape the fallout. Her mother, a strict, traditional woman, never said anything outright, but always mentioned Mark with a mix of regret and subtle reproach. At family dinners, divorce was a long, heavy silence. Her once close sister now kept her distance, neutral and cautious, as if afraid of getting pulled into something messier than she'd expected. Julia stayed in touch with a few close friends, those who listened without judgment. But even in those conversations, she no longer felt like the old Julia. She had become the friend who got divorced because she cheated, the woman who lost everything for a reunion with an old flame. A label, though invisible, she felt every single day. And within herself, Julia couldn't fully forgive either. The relationships around her might soften with time, but the relationship with oneself, that was the longest and hardest battle of all. After everything, Julia began to slow down. She spent quiet afternoons walking in the park near her apartment, sitting alone on a worn wooden bench, watching strangers pass by. She used to believe that time was something you could manage, that a few impulsive hours couldn't possibly affect an entire life. But now, she understood. Sometimes, just a few messages, a fleeting moment of weakness, can completely reshape how the world sees you, from wife, mother, friend, to a stranger in your own life. She read more. Not the academic texts she once curated as a library manager, but books on psychology, honesty, the common mistakes people make when they think they still have time to fix things. In every page, Julia saw a reflection of herself. And of Mark, of Andrew, even of the former lover, the man who passed through her life like a breeze, but left a storm behind. She no longer dreamed of reconciliation, no longer pictured Mark forgiving her, or Andrew wrapping his arms around her like he used to, but she began to forgive herself, not by forgetting, but by understanding this. A mistake doesn't erase all the good you once had, if you truly learn from it. One day, while reorganizing her bookshelf, she found an old birthday card Andrew had made when he was 10. The handwriting was crooked, childish, but full of love. "Mom, you're the best person I know. I'll always be on your side." She sat there for a long time silent, and then she cried, not out of grief, but because she knew that part of that memory still lived on, even if it might never return. In the stillness of her new life, Julia learned not to expect too much. She no longer sought validation or a second chance. Instead, she tried to live with intention, one day at a time, so that, if someday Andrew looked back or Mark remembered, they'd see. Julia didn't give up, didn't hide, and faced everything with a quiet, late-blooming courage. 2 years had passed since that fateful meeting in Boston. Julia now lived alone in a small apartment in Somerville, just outside the city. The old house she once shared with Mark and Andrew had been sold, the assets evenly divided after the divorce. Life was simpler now, less noisy, with no more pressure to get everything right. She no longer worked full-time at the city library. Instead, she took a part-time job at a small bookstore, with warm yellow lights and a little bell that rang every time someone walked in. The work was easy, low-stress, but peaceful. Regulars there knew her simply as Julia, the woman who recommended classic literature and wrapped books in brown paper with a gentle smile. No one knew her past. No one needed to. There, she wasn't the wife who cheated. She was just a middle-aged woman who loved books. As for Mark, he had a new girlfriend. Julia found out through a photo she stumbled across on a mutual friend's Facebook page. They were hiking in Colorado, and Mark's smile looked easy, unburdened. A kind of lightness she hadn't seen on him during their last years together. Of course it stung. But she also felt a strange peace, knowing that he deserved to feel happy again. Andrew, meanwhile, still kept his distance, though now and then he'd send a short text to check in. He was in college in Chicago, living in a dorm, starting his own chapters. Julia didn't pressure him, didn't scold or guilt him. She just sent her well wishes on important days and hoped that someday, when his heart had healed enough, he might look at his mother with different eyes, not filled with blame but with understanding. She didn't start dating again. Some friends suggested it, even made her a dating app profile. But Julia declined, not because she didn't believe in love anymore, but because she was learning how to love herself, something she had always placed last. She no longer tried to rewind the past, nor did she chase the future. For Julia, the present was enough because, for the first time in her life, she was truly listening to herself. One crisp October afternoon, Julia sat on her usual bench in Boston's public garden. Leaves blanketed the ground beneath her feet. The air carried a chill, stirring old memories. But this time, they didn't choke her. They were just tender, like the bittersweet aftertaste of a cup of coffee gone cold. Was there regret? Of course. Julia never denied it. If she could go back in time, she would have chosen not to text David. She would have kept her distance, wouldn't have gone to that hotel, would have returned home like a regular wife from a regular trip. But life doesn't come with a rewind button. Every choice has a price, and she had paid hers with the collapse of everything. Sleepless nights in a small apartment, the coolness in her son's voice, the silence from the man who once called her wife. Yet deep down, Julia also realized, without that fall, she might never have stopped to really see herself. She had been living like a machine, caring for her husband, raising her son, managing her work, maintaining the image of a perfect woman. But that perfection turned out to be a mask. And when it broke, she finally started being honest with herself. Now, Julia no longer sought forgiveness from others. She was learning to forgive herself not as a way to justify but as a way to move forward. The greatest freedom, she realized, didn't lie in returning to the past or being understood by someone else, but in being able to hold your head up, acknowledge your mistakes, accept the consequences, and still choose to live kindly, every single day. In her small kitchen, she still kept an old photo, Mark and Andrew at Cape Cod, smiling brightly under the sun, not as a form of punishment, but as a reminder of what once was beautiful. Those moments were real, and she didn't want to lose them again, even if now they only lived in memory. For her, it wasn't a happy ending, but it was a different kind of beginning, quieter, simpler, but true. When Julia looked back on her journey, what haunted her most wasn't the discovery or the divorce. It was that one early moment when she didn't stop to ask herself, why am I doing this? Just one casual message to an ex, one coffee that seemed harmless, one brief touch between two people who used to be in love. It all began with things that felt innocent. But in that just one time, Julia had unknowingly gambled everything: her marriage, her son's trust, her carefully built life of over 20 years. She came to understand. Nostalgia is a beautiful feeling, but it's dangerous without reason. What we remember from the past is often softened, gilded by memory. We remember our former lovers through a version of them that's kinder than reality. And if we let ourselves drift with that feeling, it's dangerously easy to trade the present for an illusion. Julia once believed that as long as she didn't love the other man, it wasn't betrayal. But the truth is, betrayal isn't just about emotion. It's in the actions, in the hiding, in the lie you tell your husband while knowing deep down you're breaking the trust it took years to build. She came to understand how fragile marriage really is, that love doesn't sustain itself just because you once made promises. It needs care. It needs open conversation. It needs honesty. And if one person begins to quietly drift away, whether in body or in mind, the distance only grows until it's too wide to bridge. Through it all, Julia learned that mistakes don't destroy us, but how we face our mistakes determines the rest of our lives. She no longer tried to fix everything. Instead, she learned to live with the consequences. And in that, she became stronger, more honest, more grounded. Julia's story isn't told to romanticize weakness, nor to shame those who falter. It's told to remind us, sometimes a single decision made in a handful of hours can alter the entire course of the life that follows.